So look, we got about 4 minutes left. I think it'd be good for me to just give a very high level introduction as to the governing documents of a company. When you create a company in New Zealand, you actually don't need a constitution. You can just go ahead and create the company, and the company can be without a constitution. But if you ever do decide to adopt a constitution, which are basically the highest law that governs the operations of the company, then the constitution needs to be uploaded to the company's office so that people can see it. Um, it's a good idea to have a constitution so that people can see what your company is about, how your company is run. And the other thing that's good about a constitution is that, as Anne Marie alluded to previously, it does allow for additional protections for directors, including indemnity for directors and the ability to purchase directors insurance for the directors. And this just means that the company is basically able to use the company's resources to protect the directors for the decisions that they make. Now, obviously, there are going to be exceptions to this. The director can't commit a criminal act as a director and then have the company basically indemnify and protect them for the director doing something that is illegal. So there are restrictions to this. So that's the Constitution. But above and beyond the Constitution, in fact, oftentimes what we will recommend to our clients is the Constitution is great, but what really you want to be talking about is a shareholders agreement. Because the shareholders agreement is basically the document that sits on top of the company, because it's the contract that binds the relationship between the owners of the company. So if you are a single shareholder and the company only has one owner, then you don't need a shareholders agreement because whatever you say goes. You're the only person that is going to vote at a shareholders meeting. But for example, let's say that you created a joint venture or you've basically partnered up with somebody and you guys have decided that you're going to work together for the purposes of this company. In that scenario, we always recommend to have a shareholders agreement because the shareholders agreement is basically a contract that will set out the terms and conditions of how the shareholders are going to deal with each other and with the company, right? And within the shareholders agreement, you can have things like, okay, what happens if we don't agree? What happens if there's a big decision that needs to be made and, one person says yes, one person says no. That's called deadlock,
And
right?
that does happen.
That can happen. Yeah. The shareholders agreement can have provisions that will say, okay, well, if you have this much percentage of the equity of the company, so if you own at least 30% of the company, then you can appoint one director. So each shareholder that has at least 30% can appoint one director, right? It will have things like restraint of trade, possibly, to say, okay, if it's me and Anne Marie that are the shareholders, right? And Anne Marie wants to leave the company, yes, she can, but I'm going to ask Anne Marie to agree, and actually all shareholders to agree that if they leave the company, then they can't be in that same industry or in that same marketplace for a year. It's a restraint on them being able to compete against the company, for example, right? So these are all things that can be negotiated and agreed to beforehand. And the reason why a shareholders agreement is so important is because you want to have these conversations, which are difficult, but you want to have them ahead of time when things are good. Because when things are bad, if the company is going through a bad patch, or, if the vision of shareholder A and shareholder B start diverging, trying to have these conversations at that time is going to be much more difficult. And at that point, you're basically in the midst of a shareholder dispute. And what I always tell my clients is, look, it might be costly for you to have a shareholders agreement. You're going to have to invest a bit of resources including time and money, in order to negotiate and sign things up. And you're going to have very difficult discussions. But this cost is a lot cheaper than trying to do it when the two parties are not aligned, when the two parties are in a dispute. And that could be in the magnitude of 10 times what the initial cost was. It's much cheaper to sign a contract now than to try to litigate and come to a conclusion during a dispute. Disputes are always very expensive.
And I think we see that practically, don't we, from time to time, where
That's right.
People should have signed such an agreement, and a few months later, they're regretting it. The reason being, of course, with a startup, at the very beginning, everything is fine. Everything is wonderful. This is going to be amazing. We're going to be $1 billion company by next year. But 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road, it's not as easy as we thought it was going to be. Actually, one of the shareholders can devote 80 hours a week because this is their baby, this is their vision. The other shareholder can devote 2 hours a week. There's a massive tension. So if you haven't got it clear in your
Yeah.
documents, you're going to regret not having them. The one other thing about the Constitution, if you don't have one, then that means the Companies Act applies, so that you can modify what the Companies Act says by having a constitution. And that's important for things like if you want to take out insurance for the directors, you have to actually say that that's permitted in the Constitution. So there's some practical reasons why you might want to have it. The last thing for me on that is I don't know why we don't require companies to have a constitution, because we used to in the pre-1993 days. I think it's a discipline for companies to state what their purpose is. And I would like to see every company with a constitution having the opening line be, we exist to, and then fill in what it is that they're there for. We require that of charities. We don't require that of companies. But I think it would change the nature and the tone of companies if they were clear and articulate about what their purposes are as well. So, yeah.